Hello, this is Niall Harris, and this is my critical analysis four discussion. Um, in these last few lectures, we actually covered an extreme, like a lot of information. So I'm going to try to get through as much as I can, as much information as I can. Um, so yeah, these last few lectures we talked about plants, plants and how they the different groups of plants and how we group those. Sorry, yes, I'm lying. How we group those, and we group those based on their characteristics, um, and also how they reproduce. Um, and then the groups of plants that we covered these last few lectures, were I vaguely stay in these groups where the mosses, the ferns, and the flowers, the seed bearing plants. Um, a little background about the evolution of plants is that we actually saw an explosion of diversity during the Ordovician period, which was around 485 million years ago. Between that, between 485 and 443 million years ago. Um, and it's important to note that during this period, this time period, the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration was extremely high, um, compared to what it is today. I believe today it's around 1/10 of what it was during this time period. I believe it was like around 4,400 and something during this time period. And right now it's around 440 parts per million. Um, and then also the the temperature, the atmospheric temperature, was also extremely high during this time period compared to where it is now. So um, that's kind of a little bit of a difference and a little bit of how plants evolved. Like I guess they kind of thrived in these conditions. Um, so the first group of plants that we had discussed was the bryophyte group. Um, and we stated that green algae was most likely the common ancestor for embryophytes, as well as bryophytes. Um, and this group, it's important to note that the gametophytes of this group are dominant, and the sporophytes of this group are dependent on the gametophytes. Um, these plants go through sexual reproduction. They'll form embryos. Um, and then, like I said, this group um includes your common mosses, your liverworts, and your hornworts. Um, we we noted that there are around 9,000 species of liverworts. Um, and these liverworts can actually be subdivided into two groups, which are the leafy liverworts and the thallose liverworts. Um, and these two subdivisions kind of describe the form of their gametophytes. Um, so liverworts actually lack conducting elements, cuticles, and stomata. Um, and later on, we'll see why stomata are important. They actually help with nutrient, or they actually help with gas exchange and water retention, and plants that contain stomata. Um, and the liverworts, for fertilization cycle, they produce gametophytes, The male thallus, which is the male part of the plant, contains an antherodiophore. And the female thallus contains a archegoniophore. Um, and the antheridiophore is what produces the sperm, and the archegoniophore is what produces the egg cells. And then once they fuse, they'll form a zygote and eventually an embryo. Um, then this embryo will eventually become the sporophyte, which will then release spores to form the gametophyte, and then the cycle repeats itself. Um, for these plants, water is necessary for fertilization. It's actually important to note that these plants are usually only found around water. Um, so yeah, water is necessary for fertilization to occur with these plants. Um, we also talked about hornworts. There's about 150 species of those. Um, their gametophytes are similar to those of the liverworts. They kind of go through the same reproductive cycle uh, that liverworts go through. Um, a difference to note about them is that their cells, the hornwort cells, contain a large chloroplast, and they contain pyrenoids. And pyrenoids are responsible uh, for producing and storing nutrients while creating a rich carbon dioxide environment. And as I mentioned earlier, stomata come into play with hornworts. Their plants actually contain stomata. Um, and then the last group, or the last group of plants that um the last division of plants that are in this group that we were talking about with the liverworts and the hornworts is the mosses. And there are about 12,000 species of moss. Um, their gametophyte has a stem-like axis with spirally arranged leaves known as phyllodes. Um, Mosses actually attach to their substrates with multicellular rhizoids. Um, and then their stem has water conducting cells called hydroids, which is super important because um, water is important for their reproductive cycle. Um, and then they also have nutrient conducting cells called leptoids. Um, and they go through the same reproductive cycle that the hornworts and the liverworts go through. So that's it for that group. The next group we talked about um was the seedless vascular plants. Um, and they're also known as pteridophytes. Um, so this group of plants includes the subdivision Psilotophyta, Lycophyta, Equistophyta, and Polypodophyta. Um, this group, the sporophytes are actually dominant um, rather than the gametophytes. So yeah, the sporophytes are dominant, and the gametophytes are independent but inconspicuous. So it's important to note that. Characteristics of these plants do include conducting tissue internally. Some of them have true leaves, roots that function in absorption, and they have smaller gametophytes. So the first group, or the first subgroup of this group of pteridophytes, is the Psilotophyta. Um, and in biology, there's always exceptions. Like I said, it's characteristic for plants in these groups to have true leaves um, and roots. Psilotophyta are an exception because they don't have true leaves or roots. Um, their gametophytes actually contain both reproductive parts, male and female. So they both produce sperm and egg um, in one gametophyte. And then once the gametophyte fertilizes, a zygote will form and eventually turn into a sporophyte. Then this sporophyte actually produces sporocytes, which those then will produce the spores. And the spores, of course, the cycle repeats itself. Um, Mycophyta plants have true roots and stems, and they're actually covered with microphyls, which are leaves with a single vein whose trace is not associated with a leaf gap. Um, their roots develop on along rhizomes, and their spores grow into independent gametophytes. Um, and those actually contain kind of the same parts that we discussed earlier with the bryophytes, the archegonia and the antheridia, which are the male and the female part. Um, so the lycophyta, their gametophytes actually contain those same parts. Um, their sperm also contain flagella so that they're able to move in water. That's the only way. If it didn't have the flagella, it would not be able to move in the water. So they actually contain flagella. And as I mentioned before, this is another group of plants that need to have water in order for it to be able to reproduce. And they also are native to areas where water is abundant, um, like near water sources. So yeah, their reproductive cycle is the same, or is pretty similar to that of the Psilotophyta, um, along with the Polypodiophyta and the Equizophyta. Their um, all their reproductive cycles are very similar. Um, Quasophyta sporophyte stems actually contain silica and microphyls that lack chlorophyll, which is the pigment. The stems of this group actually also contain carinal canals, which are responsible for conducting water with xylem and phloem to the outside, and molecular canals, which are they actually contain air. So, and then this group actually also reproduces both sexually and asexually. They reproduce asexually by fragmentation of rhizomes, and we kind of mentioned earlier that their sexual reproduction is similar to that of the Psilotophyta, the Lycophyta, and the Polypodiophyta. Um, and then the last subdivision of this whole group of pteridophytes, is the Polypodiophyta, and their sporophytes actually have megaphylls, which are leaves with multiple veins and a leaf trace associated with the leaf gap. Um, the reproduction, as I mentioned earlier, they reproduce in the same manner. Um, the main differences between these plants are their different anatomical structures. Like they have variants in their anatomical structures, um, but their reproduction cycle, their reproduction cycles are very similar, despite those differences in anatomical structures. So yeah. And then our last lecture, we discussed the seed-bearing plants, which are, your flowers, your conifers, um, those types of plants. And we also discussed that the seed-bearing plants actually have a lot of advantages over the spore plants. They can live anywhere. They don't require water for reproduction. Um, they can disperse in various ways. Um, they're actually protected by a seed coat. Um, and they provide a food source for the embryo. So yeah. Um, and then we kind of subdivided them, the seed-bearing plants, into two subgroups, which are your gymnosperms and your angiosperms. Um, the gymnosperm group, the most recognizable gymnosperms are your conifers, your deciduous trees. The ovules and the seeds of gymnosperms are known as naked seeds. They actually develop on the surfaces of specialized leaves called sporophylls. Um, and we also talked about how conifers are heterosporous, which means they develop male and female gametophytes from different types of spores, and they're actually produced by separate cones. Your male your male producing cones are a lot smaller than your female producing cones. Um, and then one tree usually contains both types of cones, both male cones, both male and female cones. Um, then wind is was responsible for dispersing the seeds. Um, and then once you have your pollen from the male cone fuse with the female cone to form a megaspore. This is the start of the reproductive cycle. It will develop into a new sporophyte and eventually a gametophyte. Then gymnosperms, we talked about how they're evolutionarily, like they came before angiosperms, so evolutionarily they're older than angiosperms. Um, Angiosperm seeds and ovules um, develop inside of ovaries. Um, Angiosperms can be monocots or dicots. There's a few differences between monocots and dicots. Monocots um, have one cotyledon. They also have leaves with parallel veins. Are complexly arranged. They have complexly arranged vascular bundles. They have a fibrous root system. And their floral parts usually come in multiples of threes. So three, six, nines. Any multiples of threes. Dicots actually have leaves with net-like venation, rather than your parallel veins. They have two cotyledons. Um, they have ring-like vascular bundles, tap roots, and their floral parts usually come in multiples of fours and fives. Angiosperms also have both male and female reproductive structures. Um, the male reproductive structure is known as a stamen, while the female reproductive structure is known as a pistil. Once a male gametophyte reaches the flower, you'll have your sperm, which will move down the pollen tube in order to reach the egg. Um, and then your sperm will fertilize your egg, forms a zygote, and then that'll then evolve into an embryo. Um, so this embryo has food, like it provides its own food, and it has a seed capsule, and all three of those parts together are what form your seed. Um, and then your seed is what eventually produces a new flower, new sporophyte, and that's pretty much what we talked about these last few lectures.